Hello, I'm Gene Schaerr, General Counsel of the Project for Privacy and Surveillance Accountability, also known as PPSA, and we welcome you to this PPSA broadcast. Today we have with us Liza Goitein of the Brennan Center for Justice and Byron Tau, a journalist and author who just published a book called Means of Control, and it's a new book detailing the shocking extent of government surveillance and especially government purchases of our data. Liza and I will ask Byron questions about his book, and we look forward to taking his questions about our legislative efforts. So, Byron, why don't we begin by your telling us a little bit about how you came to write your new book, Means of Control, and if you can, maybe give us a very top-line summary of the book's findings.
Sure, and thank you for having me. So basically, the book is about all of the ways in which the governments, primarily the US government, but the reporting applies generally and applies to all governments, are increasingly purchasing data for surveillance, for public safety, for law enforcement, because the reality is in the 21st century, we're all generating tons and tons of data all the time. Almost everything we do online or offline these days generates some sort of record or a log or a video somewhere. And a lot of that data is available for sale. And so I have basically done a 25-year deep dive into government programs that purchase data from commercial sources and the consequences for our privacy and civil liberties when this much data is available for purchase and is generally considered outside the bounds of our Fourth Amendment protections. I started writing this book because back in 2018, I got a tip over a sort of boozy Washington crowd dinner. Essentially, the tip I got was that the Pentagon was buying large amounts of the data that showed the movement of phones through this network of government contractors. And this was data that was coming off of things like mobile apps, like weather apps and dating apps and games, and was being brokered by various commercial sources. Those commercial sources were selling data to Pentagon contractors that were then providing a sort of a tool or a data set to the government. And at the time, I thought I was pretty tech savvy. I wasn't a tech reporter exactly, but I thought I understood technology and the ways in which, governments could get access to data like movement records. But this was kind of an extraordinary thing, I thought. This wasn't a vector I had considered for surveillance. This wasn't something I thought was generally known. And so I started digging into it. And at first, very slowly, because I had to come to understand a lot of different things, like first about the app ecosystem and mobile advertising. But then I had to go understand things like what the military was doing with it, or what law enforcement was doing with it, or what the Department of Homeland Security was doing with it. And in doing that kind of reporting, I started to understand that this is a larger phenomenon than just app-based data, that there is this sort of history going back to a little bit before 9/11, but 9/11 was really a catalyst in many ways of governments being very interested in acquiring this data. And, as time changed, as technology changed, the kinds of data that the government was buying changed. But the phenomenon of governments partnering or contracting with data brokers was something that goes back almost 25 years at this point. And so I built out the book in a roughly chronological order, telling the story of data brokers and their relationship with government over the past 25 years.
Byron, I found this book to be absolutely fascinating. And, I have followed your journalism for a very long time. Watching you delve into this issue in this level of detail, it's very eye-opening to read all of that. And one of the types of data that you write is most in demand by government agencies is location data. Can you explain why this data is so coveted and what it can reveal?
Sure. So yeah, this was the original tip I got, as I said, from these Pentagon contractors were buying location data. And I think it's valuable for a lot of reasons, namely because our patterns through the world do tell a lot about us. And if you have a large enough data set on people or a city or a country, you can start to tell some pretty rich stories. And so I give the example in the book of, there's this government contractor that was selling or was creating a program for government entities, but at some point he took the data he was buying and did a counterintelligence demonstration with it. And what he did is essentially take data that was coming from the app Grindr, which is an LGBTQ oriented dating or hookup app, and he basically started drawing little circles around government buildings that had a national security mission, so the Pentagon, Fort Belvoir, the FBI, et cetera, and seeing what Grindr users were using Grindr in that building during the workday, and then seeing where they went afterwards. And it was like little ant trails on a map. You could see where these employees lived. You could sometimes see where they went in proximity to other users of Grindr. So it's a very rich story, and we saw this time and time again. The same contractor did a pretty interesting project where they acquired data on Russia. And they saw that this cluster of phones seemed to be moving around wherever Putin had a public event. And they figured, oh, this is the support staff for the Russian president. This is, his political aides, his drivers, his security people. They're generating this kind of data. So you can tell a lot of rich and interesting stories if you had a data set that showcases the movement of people, and you can reveal associations, you can reveal meetings. And so governments were very eager to acquire this, especially because it was available commercially. Didn't involve breaking into anything. It didn't involve hacking anything. It didn't involve going to get a secret court order. This was just something they could buy on the commercial market. And, when I first started reporting on this, so most people were being careless with their settings, and they weren't aware that this market existed where they could potentially be tracked by people who were purchasing information about them. And so it really was the Wild West back then, because people weren't aware that these programs existed. They weren't opting out to the level that they are now. And Apple and Google have made some technological changes that have resulted in, a little bit better privacy for users. But it's a very rich and interesting data set, and governments, especially a few years ago, were super interested in it.
Well, thanks, Brian. Can you help us understand the magnitude of the personal data that the U.S. government has collected and is currently collecting on Americans?
Yeah, so it's hard to get a complete picture of this because a lot of these are sensitive programs, or they're in some cases even classified, even though we're talking about data for sale. But I basically break the book down into 4 generations of data brokers, and the government is in some way acquiring data from all 4 of them. So the earliest, most basic, what people mostly think of as a data broker were companies that came about in the 1960s. They were collecting things like addresses and other things for to do targeted advertising to help banks make credit decisions. And they were doing stuff you would see in a phone book, right? They were address history, and then they could do some basic demographics by zip code. Eventually, they started branching into consumer sentiment based on things like magazine subscriptions. So were you someone that subscribed to Golf Digest, or were you someone that subscribed to Dog Fancy, and what could we learn about you as a consumer? So that was sort of the first generation of data brokers, and they developed a relationship with the government around or somewhat before 9/11, but 9/11 again was kind of a catalyst for deepening this relationship. And they were providing lots of things like address history and some consumer preferences to governments. A few years later, governments became very interested in social media data because people were communicating so much more via Twitter, via Snapchat, via Facebook. So these brokers sprung up to, broker that kind of data. They scraped it, or they purchased access to it from Twitter and Facebook and others, and they were selling it to government entities for public safety and all sorts of other things. Then we move forward to the location data sets that I just talked about. There were brokers that were in that market. as smartphones became more of a a tool that everyone used in their everyday lives, that's when those brokers sprung up, especially when people were being very careless with their location settings and sort of oblivious to the privacy consequences. And then finally, the last generation of data brokers I talk about is what I call gray data, but it's basically just data that's out there for the taking. In particular, I focus on sort of wireless signals data. So our Bluetooth devices that we're all carrying around, that I'm wearing in my ear right now, these things emit unique identifiers, and if you have the right radio, you can pick up on them. It's very messy, chaotic data, and it's not really linked to a specific individual. But if you're a powerful enough government and you're going after a hard enough target, maybe that kind of data seems worthwhile. And so it's like Bluetooth devices, also your home wireless router. That's broadcasting a unique identifier that can be useful for intelligence purposes. Even car tires actually broadcast unique wireless identifiers because the car's tire is trying to tell the car's central computer what the tire pressure is. But there's a unique identifier associated with that. So this weird world of wireless data is sort of the frontiers of data brokering, and there are entities out there that are in the commercial market to try to do a sort of survey of what sort of consumer devices are being seen in the world. But this also has tremendous and very interesting cyber applications that governments are interested in. And so there are brokers out there that are working with governments to collect this kind of weird wireless data. And so those are the four sort of generations of data brokers. And at every turn, governments have found uses and developed relationships with people who had access to those data sets.
What do we know, if anything, about how the government is using the data that it purchases?
It's a great question. So, this was a hard story to piece together, but from what I can tell, for whatever mission the government undertakes, and that can be very benign things like traffic planning and public health, or it can be very serious things in the law enforcement, military, intelligence, and public safety realms. They're out there procuring data for whatever mission they deem is important and necessary. I focus a lot on, the government agencies with the most power to visit consequences on you. But I should say that there are, good arguments for giving traffic planners access to mobility data, or public health officials access to things like, demographic information, or things that come off devices as well. But when you're talking about the arms of the government that can target you for a drone strike, or that could arrest you, or that could do very intrusive surveillance on you, that's where I really focus my efforts. And from what I can tell, these government agencies with those missions are using it within the bounds of their mission. I don't want to imply that there are no rules about their use of it. For example, in most departments, in most agencies, you're not supposed to do things like look up your spouse or your Tinder date next week in these data sets. But so long as you're doing something that falls within the government's lawful mission, or your agency's lawful mission, generally speaking, these open source and commercially available data sets are being used.
So, and just a quick follow-up question on that. When you're talking about uses by law enforcement and intelligence agencies, some of the data that you're talking about, like location data, for instance, is information that the government would otherwise have to have a warrant or a court order in order to get hold of. Is that right?
I think that's right. I mean, different lawyers have interpreted obligations differently, but I think the Supreme Court in its jurisprudence has essentially said that, you do have some privacy interest in the totality of your movements. I think there was a GPS tracker case, and then there was a cell site location data case, that if you read them together, that does seem to be what the court is saying, that you need a warrant to strap a GPS tracker on someone's car. You need a warrant to go get lots of their historic movement records from their cell carrier. But when you're talking about the exact same data, whether it comes off a connected automobile and that automobile makes it available for purchase, or it comes off a device, all of a sudden now you're talking about almost the exact same data that the Supreme Court said that you have some privacy interest in these two landmark cases. But instead, it's just commercially available. It's out there, and advertisers are using it, mobility companies are using it, and so government lawyers have kind of said, well, we're just acting as a commercial buyer here, so yeah, we can buy that. And that's kind of the tension at the heart of the book here, that if the same data in one context, there is an expectation of privacy, there's judicial oversight over accessing it, but the exact same data coming off a weather app and making its way through this maze of app brokers and data brokers and data aggregators, the government's allowed to buy it. And I think that's really the unresolved tension at the heart of my book.
Well, with all the data available from data brokers, based on what you've come to understand, do you think it's generally possible for a determined government agency to buy enough data to be able to track a citizen's locations in nearly real time? Is that possible given the current state of the data market, do you think?
I think probably 5 years ago, it probably was for most citizens, unless they were extraordinarily privacy conscious and very careful with their settings. However, in recent years, as civil society has focused more on data brokers, as government regulators have focused on them, the big tech companies have actually made some pretty decent changes to the mobile app world. And so Apple and I think increasingly Google are actually making it a little bit more easier for consumers to understand how often apps are tracking them in the background and to give consumers meaningful information that they can take action on to opt out of it. And I think when consumers are given that choice, when Apple made it very clear to iOS users that, they were going to tell them that some weather app or some game had tracked them, 1,000 times in the past 24 hours. Are you sure you want to continue to allow that? And most consumers say no. So I think the usefulness of some of the location data has degraded in the last few years since I started doing this reporting. But there are many, many other vectors for surveillance through corporate partnerships that continue. I mean, I think automobiles are one that people are only starting to focus on, including a recent amazing New York Times story about data brokers getting auto data, auto logs of travel. And, car companies certainly have components like the AutoNav system or sometimes the, telematics thing where you press, help, I need roadside assistance. Those do collect large amounts of data, and those entities sometimes broker it. And so, there are certainly still ways for governments to get lots and lots of information about people as they move around the world or even as they move around the web.
So to that point, as consumers who download these apps and use these services and, drive these cars that are collecting our data, I mean, haven't we consented to the privacy intrusions that result from that?
Yeah, I think that is certainly the argument that these companies make. But when you dig deep into these claims, it's not meaningful consent, at least in my view. So, a lot of the times these companies are saying that this data is quote unquote anonymized. However, it's very difficult to anonymize movement data just by the very nature of the kind of data we're talking about. I live here in Washington, D.C. I live on Capitol Hill. I go to an office in Georgetown. I ride my bike almost every day right down the mall. Even if you don't attach my name to a movement data set of all of Washington, D.C., you could probably pick me out because I'm the only person that wakes up on this block and goes to an office in Georgetown. And if you just had a tiny little bit of information about me, like where I worked, and maybe I tweeted something about living on Capitol Hill, you could probably find me in that data set. And so, it's hard to anonymize these things. So, consumers are kind of being, misled when these privacy policies say that it's anonymized. And then second, companies can't really, they're also saying things like, well, we're collecting it for commercial purposes, but of course they don't know where it goes after they sell it to a data aggregator or data broker. And so, when you add both of those things together, that's not real consent. The consumer isn't meaningfully being told what exactly is being collected, what are the real privacy risks with it, and where the heck it's going. And so, that would be my argument that consent here is not really full and fair to the consumer who's, even if they were to read this privacy policy, which I think we know no one really does.
Well, let me ask a somewhat different question. Why did you choose the title of your book?
So it's a quote from Thomas Pynchon. And in anticipation of people asking me this question, I then had to go read and think about Gravity's Rainbow, which is where it comes from. The reason I like the title is the quote is something like, once the technical means of control have reached a certain size, a certain degree of being connected to one another, the chances for freedom are over for good. And what I like about the sentiment expressed in that is that freedom requires a certain amount of space. It requires a certain amount of civic space and personal space. And that when you're talking about powerful systems, both corporate and governmental, coming together and working in cahoots, you are talking about very powerful systems that could potentially impact the freedom and dignity of individuals. And so I really liked the quote. It really stuck with me. It was given to me by this researcher who I hired, actually, who said, I love this topic. And there's this Pynchon quote that's been going through my mind for 15, 20 years. And here it is. And so I actually slogged my way through Gravity's Rainbow to make sure that I could talk about it intelligently when asked.
And just to follow up, when you say freedom requires a certain amount of space, is it fair to say that that means a certain amount of privacy for individuals?
I think that is fair to say that, we don't, at least in the United States and at least historically, we've traditionally protected personal privacy and personal freedoms by limiting the amount of information that governments have access to. But today there's so much information that corporate America has, and the government also has pretty intrusive and powerful surveillance tools that it can deploy. And when you combine those two powers, you get a serious threat to civil liberties and privacy and dignity, and at least something that we as citizens, we as voters, and we as consumers should be aware of as we think about what technologies we want to buy and what policies we want to adopt. And so I think that's the big idea I would take away, that I would say that people should take away. So switching gears a little bit, I'm going to now transition from being guest to putting on my journalist hat, and I'm going to ask you guys a couple of questions because I know these issues that I write about in the book are now being fiercely debated on Capitol Hill. There's a 702 intelligence reauthorization. And in addition, there's some amendments that directly address a lot of what I wrote about in the book. So I know you guys are active on this issue, and I was hoping I could ask you some questions about those things. So I don't know, Gene, do you want to set the stage for us and tell us what is Section 702 and what is the fight on the Hill about currently?
Well, Section 702 is, as I know you know, is a provision of the law that allows the government to surveil foreign people, basically. And it was designed to provide some degree of oversight in Congress over the activities of the intelligence agencies with respect to surveillance of foreigners. And in recognition of the reality that surveillance of foreigners is likely to involve, incidentally, some collection of information about Americans. And so Section 702 authorizes that surveillance, but also puts certain guardrails on it, requires the intelligence agencies to get certain approvals before they can engage in the kind of mass surveillance that Section 702 authorizes.
And Liza, what's the big sticking point in this debate? Because it seems like there is some consensus that it's an important tool, but the devil's in the details. So can you tell folks what is it that Congress is hung up on in terms of the reauthorization?
Sure. So as Gene said, the law authorizes warrantless surveillance of foreigners overseas, essentially. But of course, foreigners communicate with Americans. And so the law sweeps in really enormous volumes of Americans' communications, or the surveillance sweeps in those communications. And the government refers to this collection as incidental collection of Americans' communications. And that's critical because if the government's intent were actually to eavesdrop on those Americans, it would have to get a warrant. And so in order to prevent the government from using Section 702 as an end run around the Fourth Amendment, Congress required the government to minimize the retention and use of Americans' communications. But what is happening instead, and what's been happening for a long time now, is that all the agencies that receive Section 702 data have a practice of running searches of that data for the express purpose of finding and reviewing Americans' communications. And the FBI actually conducted 200,000 of these backdoor searches in 2022 alone. So about 500 warrantless searches for Americans' communications every day. And that makes it pretty clear that an authority that was supposed to be targeted only at foreigners overseas has in fact become a very powerful domestic spying tool. Beyond that, there have been some very alarming abuses involved with these searches that we've learned about just in the last few years, including searches by the FBI for the communications of Black Lives Matter protesters, members of Congress, in one case, more than 19,000 donors to a congressional campaign, multiple US government officials, journalists, and political commentators, and the list goes on. So for that reason, a lot of members of Congress on both sides of the aisle have said that they will not reauthorize Section 702 without major reforms to protect Americans' privacy. And one of the things you mentioned is that, Section 702 is a valuable tool. What's important to understand is that the value of the program lies overwhelmingly in the collection and review of foreigners' communications. These backdoor searches, according to the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, actually have provided relatively little value.
Gene, do you want to talk us through the various reform proposals? I know there are a couple of them floating out there, and some of them might be more deserving of the phrase reform than others, but there are certainly a number of bills floating around. I believe there's a version from House Intel. There's a judiciary in the House version, and I think Dick Durbin just released his own proposal. So what are you able to tell us about these proposals and what the big differences and similarities are in all of them?
Sure. Well, let me just give you a thumbnail sketch. There are, in fact, 4 bills now under consideration, one from each of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, and another from each House's Judiciary Committee. And, as you might expect, the bills that have come out of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees tend to be very limited to the extent that they offer any reforms at all. They are very, very limited. And in fact, the House Intelligence Bill would actually dramatically increase the authority that's given to the intelligence agencies to spy on Americans by increasing the range of communications providers that are subject to the law. And it's not surprising that would happen, because what tends to happen is that the intelligence committees in both the House and the Senate, they have a long history of essentially getting captured by the agencies that they're supposed to be overseeing. And part of that is driven by the classified nature of the information that they share. I mean, the members of the intelligence committees, have ready access to a lot of classified information, but that information comes to them from the intelligence agencies, and so the intelligence agencies are able to pick and choose what classified information they share with them. Those members of those committees are in turn not really able to effectively share that information with other members of Congress. And over time, they just tend to get captured by the intelligence agency. So, but both of the judiciary committees actually have primary jurisdiction over the entirety of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, of which Section 702 is a part. And the reason for that is that FISA deals with, to a large extent, with domestic surveillance issues. And so the judiciary committees in both houses do have jurisdiction over any surveillance of Americans, whether it's called incidental or direct or anything else. And they have primary jurisdiction over law enforcement. And of course, the main agencies of concern to Americans are the domestic law enforcement agencies, not the CIA and agencies like that. So, both judiciary committees and this is true of both Republicans and Democrats, the people who tend to gravitate to those committees are people who are concerned about protecting Americans' privacy and civil liberties generally. And so, as you would expect, the bills that have been introduced in both of those committees are much more robust in the reforms that they would require. The two principal issues that separate the judiciary committees from the intelligence committees have to do with when domestic enforcement agencies would be required to get a warrant. As I think Liza alluded to, one issue is, do the agencies have to get a warrant when they do what's called a backdoor search, where they search their database of material compiled under 702 for information about Americans, and their proposals to impose that kind of a warrant requirement on a limited but I think appropriate basis in both of the Judiciary Committee bills. The other big warrant-related issue is, are domestic enforcement agencies going to have to get a warrant before they search any databases of purchase data in circumstances where they would otherwise have to get a warrant in order to look at that information. And so that's called closing the data broker loophole, or at least restricting the data broker loophole. And both Judiciary Committee bills have measures that address that. Both of the Intel committees are just fighting tooth and nail against imposing any such requirement.
And just to add this quickly to what Gene was saying, the data broker loophole provisions of the Judiciary Committee bills would actually prohibit the purchase of information that would otherwise require a warrant or a court order or a subpoena to obtain. So if you would have to go through some kind of legal process ordinarily, if there are either statutory or constitutional privacy protections in place for that data, then the government can't buy its way around those protections by using data brokers. And that's essentially what the judiciary bills would do. There's also, those are sort of the bills that have passed through committee. In addition, there is the bill that you mentioned, Byron, that Senator Durbin and Senator Lee recently introduced just a week or two ago, which obviously has not been through committee at this point. That bill also tackles the backdoor search loophole and the data broker loophole, and it requires a warrant for backdoor searches, but it's a modified requirement. So that requirement would not apply before the government ran the search. It would apply after the government ran the search if the search actually returned any responsive information. And the idea there is that most of the time it doesn't return responsive information. And so the government doesn't have to bother with a warrant in those cases. Only if it returns data does the government have to get a warrant in order to access and view that data. And the data broker provisions of the Durbin-Lee bill are also a little bit different. They sort of allow the government to overcollect a little bit upfront if the government can't readily identify whether a data set has Americans' information or can't segregate out Americans' information. It can still acquire the data set, but then there are very strict limits afterwards on querying that information for Americans and on what the government has to do if it comes across information about Americans.
So the argument I've heard the most against the data broker provision, sort of fixing the loophole, or I think the original version was called the Fourth Amendment is Not for Sale Act. A lot of folks in the intelligence community say, well, this data is out there and Home Depot uses it to target ads and Starbucks uses it to figure out where to put a store, and foreign governments can buy it through shell companies. When you stop public safety entities or national security entities with sort of a counterintelligence mission from getting this data, you're just stopping them. What's the response to that? That this bill would single out a government, that this bill would single out government agencies with important missions from accessing data that commercial providers and anyone on the street can get.
Well, it's just false to say that the bills would stop them from getting the data. All it would do is, given that domestic law enforcement agencies are capable, as you pointed out, of doing lots of horrendous things to American citizens if they so choose. Consistent with the Fourth Amendment, both of these bills would simply require that a court authorize the acquisition of those kinds of data on a citizen before they can be used for law enforcement purposes.
Yeah, I mean, I want to be very clear. I would support comprehensive consumer data privacy legislation that would address the private market in this data as well. I think that's very important. But in the meantime, there's absolutely no reason to wait in order to prevent the government from purchasing this information because, as Gene says, the government has a range of coercive powers over the individual that private companies don't have. Like, I understand that Home Depot is trying to sell me porch furniture. The government can investigate you, arrest you, jail you, fine you, tax you, audit you, deny you public benefits. The government has these powers over the individual. And that's why we have a Fourth Amendment that applies to the government. It doesn't apply to private companies. So there is a reason to be uniquely concerned about law enforcement and intelligence agencies' access to this sensitive information. When it comes to foreign governments, that is also a major concern. And again, there is legislation that has been introduced that would deal with that problem. President Biden is starting to tackle it with the executive order he recently put out about limiting exports of information to certain foreign governments. But again, in the meantime, the fact that the Chinese government is not respecting Americans' liberties and privacy is not a reason for our government to show that same respect. We hold our government, our Constitution holds our government to a higher standard, and adopting the rationale that if the Chinese government does it, our government should be able to do it would launch a race to the bottom with grave consequences and implications for Americans' liberties across a range of government practices.
Yeah,
I guess maybe
think
I would
go ahead.
If I can just follow up on that, I might respond succinctly to that analogy this way. As soon as Home Depot acquires the power to send a SWAT team to my house at 6 a.m. and get me out of bed and haul me away in handcuffs in front of my family, then I will accept the validity of the analogy between government purchases of data and Home Depot's purchases. But until then, it's a very different animal.
I think that bill that Liza referenced about Congress trying to crack down on foreign data transfers, I believe that passed 414 to 0, which is not something you see in the modern Congress. So looking forward, Congress is out right now. They're back in a few weeks or maybe next week. What's on the agenda? What do you expect will happen with surveillance? Because it seems like we're running right up on the deadline at this point. So Gene, do you want to start and then turn to Liza? What do you expect is going to happen in the next few weeks on 702 reauthorization?
Well, we understand, and of course, all these things are subject to change, but we understand that the Speaker's office in the House is planning to hold a vote or a series of votes on FISA Section 702 reform and reauthorization very shortly after the House returns from their recess, which will be April 8th, I believe. Now we've heard this before, and it hasn't always happened as predicted, but we understand that is the current plan in the House, and apparently there. And this has been publicly reported, apparently there's still some kinds of negotiations going on among the leadership of the House Judiciary Committee and the House Intelligence Committee and the Speaker's office as to exactly what those votes will look like. There may be kind of a minimal, what they're calling a base bill that will reauthorize Section 702 and contain certain reforms within it that the Intel Committee is willing to agree to, and then with the idea that both the Intel Committee and the Judiciary Committee would each get to have votes on their three favorite amendments. And so the votes on the warrant requirements would likely come as votes on amendments to the base bill. And that was the system that was sort of set up and agreed to, apparently, a couple of weeks ago, until Chairman Turner of the Intelligence Committee backed out of it.
Liza, I know predicting is hard, especially about the future, but what do you see happening in the coming weeks?
I think what Gene said is exactly right. And hopefully that's an agreement to give members a chance to vote on these important reforms, these critical reforms. Closing the backdoor search loophole and closing the data broker loophole will be offered to members of the House. That is the key. And whether it's offered because Speaker Johnson brings the Protect Liberty Act to the floor, or because he brings a version of the SAFE Act, the Durbin-Lee bill, to the floor, or whether he brings to the floor this base bill that really does nothing at all and then allows members to offer amendments. As long as members have a chance to vote on reforms, I think that is what should happen. One of the sort of issues here is that Speaker Johnson has seemed all along to be intent on finding a path forward that will please both the judiciary committees and the intelligence committees. He wants a consensus bill that everyone will agree to. That doesn't exist. You can't have a bill that both has meaningful reform and preserves the status quo. You can't do both. And so ultimately, Speaker Johnson has to lead, and he has to ensure that members have the chance to weigh in on which they would prefer, on which approach they would prefer. And, majority rules. That's how Congress works, not by consensus of every possible stakeholder. That would be lovely, but that's, it doesn't work that way today, and I don't think it ever worked that way. So that's really what needs to happen. Give members of the House a chance to vote on whether they want major reform, or whether they're happy with the status quo. And so, I think Speaker Johnson will at some point realize that that's what needs to happen.
And just to follow up on that, that process of having votes on each of the key proposed reforms, both of the warrant requirements and some other important reforms that are part of both Judiciary Committee bills. That's really the only way the American people can decide, through their representatives in Congress, the extent to which their own government is going to be allowed to surveil them. And there are obviously safety issues that have to be factored into that decision, but that's one of the most important reasons we elect people to the United States Congress, is so that they can act on our behalf to strike the appropriate balance between privacy and security, and to ensure that what our own government is doing with data that it has collected about us is actually consistent with our own desires as a people.
Well, that's all I have for questions. I'm going to pass the moderator baton back to you, Gene, and just say in advance, thank you for having me on to talk about means of control and for the discussion about 702 and what's next in surveillance law.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. If you could talk to, if you were given the podium in the House of Representatives as they're about to vote on these provisions, and assume that a fair vote has been allowed, what would you tell them based on what you've learned in writing your book?
It's hard for me to answer because, the House has to decide what the House is going to do, but I would tell them to read Means of Control and to tell everyone about it. And I think it would actually inform a lot of what they're grappling with in terms of foreign data transfers, as well as questions about what the rules should be about government access. So, I tried to write it as a reporter and just to report what I've found. And I hope policymakers and civil society folks will find it interesting.
Hear, hear. I think every member of Congress and every staffer should read this book. It should be required reading.
I agree. Well, thank you again for joining us.